One of the most important consequential archaeological discoveries of all time, the Dead Sea Scrolls, might be older than we initially thought.
We thought we knew the story of the Dead Sea Scrolls buried for centuries, decoded by scholars, tucked safely into history. But then, an AI stepped in. It didn't believe, it didn't guess, it just read. And what it found? It's shaking the foundations of religion, rewriting timelines, and raising questions no one expected.
Well, for one thing, it's important to prove that they are 2,000 years old at least in order to connect them to the time frame of the Second Temple period, to the time frame of Jesus, of John the Baptist.
This isn't just about ancient ink. It's about what happens when machines read our oldest truths better than we can. The past is speaking again, and this time it sounds different. Old and the New Era. Humanity has long stood in awe of the Dead Sea Scrolls, those fragile fragments whispering across millennia from the caves of Qumran. Discovered between 1946 and 1956, these ancient manuscripts revolutionized our understanding of the Second Temple era, early Judaism, and even the origins of Christianity. Scholars dated them using paleography, the study of ancient handwriting, and radiocarbon dating, placing their creation roughly between the 3rd century BCE and the 1st century CE. It was a tidy, scholarly frame, script styles evolving over time, texts preserved in the arid Judean desert, echoing a bygone world. But what if that neat timeline is flawed? Enter the latest disruptor, an artificial intelligence named Enoch. Developed by researchers at the University of Groningen, Enoch isn't just applying radiocarbon readings or dotting scripts on a paleography graph. Instead, it's been trained on thousands of fragments, handwriting and dating data combined, to detect nuanced stylistic markers humans can't see. Tiny imperfections in stroke weight, spacing, curvature, statistical patterns invisible to the naked eye. When these traces are analyzed en masse, the machine begins to infer age with uncanny precision, reducing uncertainty to mere decades rather than centuries. We stand before a recalibrated history, a timeline stretched backward by centuries, a tradition that may have begun long before previously believed. The stakes are immense. At stake is our understanding of how, when, and why the canonical texts were created, and how they shaped the unfolding narratives of biblical prophecy, faith formation, and the onslaught of Hellenistic influence. The scrolls as we knew them. At the heart of our story lies the cave at Qumran, perched above the Dead Sea. Between the 40s and the 50s, Bedouin shepherds stumbled upon jars stuffed with parchment and papyrus. These scrolls felt like a direct line to an ancient world. Prayers, hymns, biblical texts, sectarian rules. They filled gaps in our knowledge and challenged existing theories. But their dating was dependent on two key methods. First, paleography. Scholars grouped the handwriting into Hasmonean, Herodian, and italicized Second Temple styles. They tracked a broad arc of evolution. And then, radiocarbon dating. Scientists chemically analyzed fragments to pinpoint carbon-14 decay. Results suggested the texts ranged from the mid-3rd century BCE to the mid-1st century CE. Thus emerged a narrative that Hasmonean scripts emerging around 200 BCE, Herodian hand dominating between 50 BCE and 50 CE. Everything aligned. Archaeologists built layers of historical certainty. Biblical scholars used these dates to anchor textual origins. Even popular documentaries echoed these time frames. It was a stable consensus, but this consensus has always harbored uncertainty. Radiocarbon dating delivers a margin, often 50 to 100 years. Paleography, while informed, is subjective. Different scholars occasionally time-stamped the same fragment differently. For years, critics warned, "We should trust, but verify." Introducing Enoch, the AI revolutionary. Now we pivot to Enoch. Imagine pairing a script fragment, call it F247, with a known date, say 150 BCE, then scanning every loop and line, every abbreviation for microvariations. Then repeat this for thousands of fragments, spanning centuries. Feed it into a neural network. The AI learns underlying patterns, like a forensic handwriting profiler for antiquity. It internalizes a statistical model that maps visual cues to dates. Importantly, unlike a traditional black box AI, Enoch transparently highlights the features it used: stroke slant, pen pressure, letter spacing. This adds credibility in the eyes of paleographers. It's not magic. It's meticulous pattern recognition applied at unprecedented scale. In recent months, the Groningen team applied Enoch to dozens of key fragments. The results were astonishing and controversial. Texts previously assumed to belong to the late Hasmonean period now register significantly older. Herodian handwriting appears centuries earlier than our accepted timeline. Certain biblical texts like Daniel, 4Q Daniel C, and Koheleth or Ecclesiastes show match points not long after their purported composition. A few fragments, like 4Q112, may now be dated as early as 230 BCE, pulling them 2 full centuries closer to the presumed time of writing. Too technical? Yup, that's how AI works. Too much brain in a technology. The first shockwaves. What got redated? Side-by-side, radiocarbon and paleographic analysis previously placed it somewhere between 100 BCE and 50 BCE. Now, Enoch suggests 160 BCE, mere decades after the Book of Daniel was likely penned. This proximity aligns the physical artifact with the text's authorship era in a way never before seen. Suddenly, scholars no longer have to rely on conjecture. They hold a physical link to the text. Likewise, the Koheleth scroll, thought to be a later copy, now seems to date from the mid-2nd century BCE, perhaps cheering traditional assumptions about authorship around 260 BCE. Instead of copying centuries later, this could be a near-contemporary transcript. But perhaps the most profound twist comes from generic Hasmonean fragments, generic rule books, hymnals, sectarian instructions. Those, too, seem to predate established paleographic timelines. The common script evolves not gradually across centuries, but in overlapping styles across different regions. The old script-based culture lock collapses. What does this rewriting of history mean? On one level, it's scholarly. It forces archaeologists to review strata and revise chronological frameworks. It suggests literate religious communities and script-based textual traditions flourished earlier than we believed. That implies Jewish theological development was well underway before Roman control, exhibiting complexity, organization, and script literacy in the 3rd century BCE. On a broader scale, the implications ripple outward, intersecting with early Christian history. Many early Christian authors relied on Hebrew scripture, texts like Daniel and Koheleth. If their sources are guaranteed to have existed in written form during or shortly after the Hellenistic period, then the textual continuity between Jewish thought and Christian writings appears strengthened. It rewrites the emergence of the religious tradition we now call Christianity, not as an isolated phenomenon, but the logical extension of a literate, vibrant Judean religious culture that predates Roman occupation. From theory to skepticism. No major breakthrough comes without pushback, and the unveiling of Enoch's AI-driven analysis of the Dead Sea Scrolls is no exception. Prominent critics within the academic community have raised serious and thoughtful objections, urging caution in how these new findings are interpreted and applied. One concern centers on the training data used to develop Enoch's neural network. Because it was trained on surviving fragments, some scholars worry that the dataset may unrepresentatively favor certain scribal communities, those whose documents happen to survive the centuries. If the sample is skewed, the AI's predictions could reflect the biases of preservation rather than a truly comprehensive view of the past. Another issue is the inherent uncertainty in radiocarbon dating itself. While this method remains a cornerstone of archaeological science, it comes with built-in error margins, often spanning several decades. Critics point out that while AI outputs may appear exact, they are still derived from these inherently fuzzy datasets. Are we, they ask, falling into the trap of false precision? Is there a risk that Enoch is overfitting patterns in a body of data too thin to support the weight of its conclusions? Stylistic evolution also poses a challenge. Letter forms and scribal conventions do not always change in a straight line over time. In some cases, older styles persisted alongside newer ones, especially in conservative or isolated communities. What appears to be an older script may simply reflect regional variation or the deliberate retention of a traditional writing style. This phenomenon, known as stylistic drift, complicates the assumption that script automatically indicates chronology. Finally, there is a broader philosophical and methodological caution shared by many scholars. Artificial intelligence is a powerful tool, but it cannot replace human judgment. It may help illuminate patterns, generate new hypotheses, or even confirm existing theories, but it must be used in conjunction with established paleographic methods and historical context. The consensus among experts is clear. Multi-method convergence remains essential. AI can guide, but it should not decide. These objections are healthy. After all, even long-established paleographers make room for alternative readings. But the tension between human expertise and algorithmic analysis is real and watched closely. For the first time, we are formalizing skepticism about AI authority, no longer simply asking, can machines date ancient texts? But should we let them? The scrolls were silent for nearly 2 millennia, crumbling in caves while civilizations rose and fell. But today, they speak again, not through prophets or scribes, but through silicon and code. Artificial intelligence, born of an entirely different kind of literacy, has translated whispers in ink into proclamations that shake history itself. And yet, behind every machine revelation stands a very human question. What does this mean? Unraveling the timeline. To understand the magnitude of what's been uncovered, one must return to the basic assumptions underpinning our knowledge of ancient Judaism and early scriptural tradition. Prior to the rise of AI-assisted paleography, dating a manuscript was part science, part art. Scholars could say, based on letter shapes and spacing, that a certain fragment probably came from the Hasmonean era, perhaps 150 BCE, give or take 50 years. Radiocarbon dating would then either confirm or complicate the picture. These tools were sufficient for decades, giving scholars a scaffolding to map the evolution of ancient thought. But with the arrival of Enoch, the scaffolding starts to tremble. Take, for instance, the fragment labeled 4Q112. Long assumed to belong to the latter part of the Hasmonean period, it was comfortably placed around 100 BCE. But Enoch flagged unique stylistic features, tight vertical compression, specific tail curvatures on certain Hebrew letters, that, when cross-referenced against thousands of similar samples, pointed to an origin closer to 230 BCE. This isn't just a 100-year recalibration. It's a paradigm shift because it pushes the textual record of that particular theological community back into a period many thought was too early for such religious writing to flourish. It forces us to reimagine the 3rd century BCE not as a prelude to scriptural culture, but as part of its epicenter. Similarly, when multiple Herodian-style fragments were redated to well before 50 BCE, the implications were even more jarring. The Herodian script, previously believed to mark the early Roman period, was now cropping up in pre-Roman contexts. That suggests either the script was adopted earlier than previously thought, or that Roman presence in Judea wasn't the cultural inflection point scholars assumed. It raises a haunting question. How much else have we gotten wrong? These aren't theoretical tweaks. These changes affect how we understand the formation of biblical canon, the identity of communities like the Essenes, and even the transmission of messianic expectations during the Second Temple era. It reopens debates many believed were settled and casts doubt on the linear, progressive view of Jewish textual history. Scholars react. The academic world is both thrilled and uneasy. On one side, champions of digital humanities hail the development as a breakthrough. Mladen Popovic, director of the Qumran Institute at the University of Groningen, described the research as a new door into the ancient world.
In addition to experts on ancient Judaism, there are also experts on medieval Jewish paleography and book culture, and also experts on other historical corpora.
For scholars like Popovic, AI doesn't replace traditional methods. It enhances them, offering cross-checks and previously impossible levels of analysis. His collaborator, Maruf Dali, emphasized the transparency of Enoch's outputs. Unlike many AI systems that obscure their logic, Enoch highlights the exact features it uses to arrive at conclusions. We're not just handed a number, Dali explained. We're given a visual map of the AI's reasoning. This builds trust among researchers who are understandably skeptical of machines making historical judgments. But not all voices are so enthusiastic. Christopher Rolston, a professor of Northwest Semitic languages at George Washington University, cautions against leaning too heavily on algorithmic precision. The science may be exact, he said in an interview, but our interpretation of that science is still deeply human. AI doesn't know history, it knows patterns. He worries that, in our rush to quantify the past, we risk erasing the nuances that only human scholarship can see. Others have pointed out that ancient scribes were not consistent. They were trained in specific schools, followed regional conventions, and sometimes intentionally mimicked older styles. A fragment that looks older, according to Enoch, might in fact be a ceremonial reproduction or a throwback, what we might today call a retro font. Style is not always a timestamp, and yet the critics are united on one point. This technology cannot be ignored. Whether one agrees with its conclusions or not, AI has made the Dead Sea Scrolls a living subject of debate again. And that, they agree, is a good thing. A living tradition. Now, it's easy to think of ancient texts as fixed, ossified relics, but in truth, they are part of a living continuum, copied, edited, interpreted, and reinterpreted by generations. The Dead Sea Scrolls were not holy fossils buried to be admired. They were tools of community, worship, and instruction. They were active, alive. What AI has done is remind us of that. By shifting our sense of when these texts were written, it has reopened the question of why they were written at all. What was the community at Qumran reacting to? Were they retreating from the Hellenistic influences of Seleucid rule? Were they anticipating messianic upheaval? Were they preserving an older, even more ancient tradition under threat? If these scrolls are older than we thought, then perhaps the theology they contain is older too. Perhaps beliefs we associate with late Judaism or even early Christianity, like resurrection, apocalyptic expectation, divine judgment, were already well developed by the 3rd century BCE. That would radically change our understanding of how religious ideas evolve. It also raises questions about authorship. If the Book of Daniel, for example, was physically recorded within a generation or two of its writing, it suggests that its prophetic voice wasn't just literary fiction, but part of an urgent cultural response. Daniel's visions of empires rising and falling may have resonated with the people who were watching empires rise and fall in real time. Likewise, Koheleth's existential musings, vanity of vanities, all is vanity, take on deeper poignancy if penned not in a later era of Roman disillusionment, but in the shadow of Seleucid oppression. The tone of those texts changes when the historical context changes. AI hasn't just moved dates, it's reframed meaning. The cave remains open. There's something poetic about the fact that a 21st century algorithm has reopened a mystery buried in the 2nd century BCE. The Dead Sea Scrolls, once forgotten in the sands of Qumran, have become one of the most vibrant and contested fields in modern historical study. And now, thanks to artificial intelligence, we're not just rereading them, we're reinterpreting our entire relationship with the past. For decades, archaeologists and theologians tried to seal the scrolls into a fixed narrative. This is when they were written. This is what they meant. This is where they fit. But history does not behave. It resists finality. And now, as we map the microscopic quirks of letters onto grand civilizational questions, we find ourselves asking more, not fewer, questions. Enoch has not closed the book. It has torn it open again. History is not a museum. It is not dust on glass or marble plaques. History is a living conversation between the past and the present. A dialogue across centuries where what we know is constantly under revision. And now, for the first time in human civilization, one of the participants in that dialogue isn't human. Artificial intelligence doesn't feel reverence. It doesn't believe. It doesn't tremble before prophecy. But it does see patterns, faster and more precisely than we ever could. That power, applied to the most sacred of texts, brings both promise and peril. What we are witnessing isn't just a technological leap. It's a new chapter in how we understand our own story. Faith meets machine. For many people, sacred texts are more than literature. They are foundational. They define purpose, destiny, morality, identity. The Book of Daniel is not just an ancient manuscript, it is scripture. Ecclesiastes isn't just philosophical musing, it is existential truth. These scrolls, though fragile and fragmented, hold spiritual weight for millions. So, what happens when an algorithm tells us we've misunderstood them? It's tempting to imagine that faith and science must clash here, that the cold logic of AI stands in opposition to divine inspiration. But that binary is too simple and ultimately untrue. The tension isn't between belief and data. It's between our expectations of certainty and the unsettling freedom of discovery. If Enoch is right, and many of these scrolls were written far earlier than we believed, then it doesn't diminish their spiritual power. On the contrary, it deepens it. It roots these ideas in an even more ancient soil. It suggests that the yearning for justice, the hope for redemption, the cry for wisdom, these were not late additions to religion. They were part of its core from the beginning. In that light, the AI doesn't threaten faith. It tests it, not with contradiction, but with complexity. The the dates shift, the margins narrow, and in the dust stirred up by the algorithm, the outlines of a deeper truth begin to emerge. The Dead Sea Scrolls have always hovered between the scholarly and the sacred. For academics, they are a treasure trove, texts in Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek, revealing alternate versions of biblical books and community rules from an enigmatic sect. For believers, they are something closer to relics, physical evidence that what was written down so long ago has survived the ages. Now, with new dating tools, we face an uncomfortable but exhilarating proposition: that the timeline of Scripture's emergence is not as linear or neat as we thought, that multiple communities over a longer period were writing and preserving sacred texts simultaneously. That inspiration, perhaps, did not follow a single divine whisper, but a polyphony of voices shaped by persecution, politics, and prophecy. This realization doesn't invalidate the sacredness of the scrolls, it humanizes them. It makes them more miraculous, not less. Because what we see now is not just a single stream of tradition, but a braided river of ideas, flowing together across generations, sometimes clashing, sometimes merging, always moving towards something transcendent. The AI does not reduce these scrolls to data points. It reveals just how much life they once carried, and still do. There's a deeper philosophical question here. What does it mean to let a machine read our most ancient texts? Enoch doesn't understand what it's looking at. It has no sense of God, of covenant, of exile or redemption. It doesn't care if the scroll it analyzes shaped the theology of nations. And yet, in its unfeeling logic, it has shown us something we missed. Something that centuries of study, devotion, and debate could not fully uncover. Is this a triumph of technology or a warning? We are entrusting AI not just with tasks of convenience, but with guardianship of memory. We are allowing it into the sanctum of human meaning.
But there were a few that were very different. Here's a chart of the date ranges and the differences between the dates that had been accepted and the new date ranges arrived at with the help of AI.
Already, algorithms shape what we see, what we buy, how we vote. Now they are shaping what we believe about our past. There's power in that, but also risk. AI is not neutral. It reflects the values and blind spots of those who build it. If it becomes the primary interpreter of historical truth, what safeguards do we have against distortion? What happens when the algorithm becomes the archive? These are not reasons to reject AI. They are reasons to be vigilant. The Dead Sea Scrolls remind us that truth can survive centuries of burial. But that survival depends on the integrity of those who seek it. We must ensure that our digital tools remain exactly that: tools, not arbiters. Servants of curiosity, not masters of narrative. What has become clear through this journey is that the story of the Dead Sea Scrolls is far from over. Yes, we have more precise dates now. Yes, we've realigned our timelines. But in doing so, we've also reopened questions we thought were closed. Who were the scribes who wrote these texts? What forces drove them to preserve these particular words? How did their worldview shape what they chose to include or exclude? We may never know all the answers, but we know more than we did before. And the pursuit continues. More fragments remain to be analyzed, more texts remain unread. More caves may still hide secrets. And now we have tools that can help us look deeper, further, faster. This is the real gift of the AI revolution. Not certainty, but possibility. It allows us to ask bolder questions, to test old assumptions, to see in the curl of a letter not just style, but history. And so the past, paradoxically, becomes more alive. more present. Shadows in the scrolls. There's a detail in the scrolls that AI didn't predict. Not a letter or a date, but a silence. Among the thousands of fragments, scholars have found evidence of missing texts, lines deliberately cut off, sections erased, gaps where something once was. For years, researchers believed these gaps were simply the result of damage, mold, decay, sandstorms, but recent digital reconstructions using multispectral imaging reveal a more unsettling possibility. Some of these omissions appear intentional. It's as if someone, somewhere, didn't want certain ideas to survive. One example lies in the so-called apocryphal Psalms, hymns and poems never canonized but widely copied. One scroll, 11Q5, includes a series of songs attributed to David that aren't found in any modern Bible. One of them, a striking meditation on divine justice and human corruption, ends abruptly mid-line. Not due to damage, but to an unnaturally straight cut in the parchment. It's a surgical silence. AI can't explain that. It can only see what's there. It can't yet infer intention, fear, censorship. But humans can, and it leads us to one of the most unnerving questions yet raised by this technology. What if the scrolls weren't just written earlier than we thought, but were already editing history at the moment they were written? The politics of preservation. We often think of ancient scripture as eternal truth, divinely inspired, faithfully copied, frozen in time. But the reality is far messier. These texts were written by real people in turbulent times, often under threat, in exile, or at the edge of empires. Their decisions, what to include, what to redact, how to phrase a commandment, were not always theological. Sometimes they were political. The Dead Sea Scrolls come from a community obsessed with purity, order, and divine judgment. They called themselves the Sons of Light and saw the outside world as corrupted, impure. To them, preserving their truth was a matter of survival. And so they wrote and rewrote and possibly removed. One theory gaining traction is that some scrolls were never meant for mass circulation. They were internal documents, sectarian records, apocalyptic forecasts, esoteric calendars. If that's true, then AI's revelations are even more extraordinary. Because we're not just uncovering early versions of familiar scripture, we're glimpsing a parallel stream of belief, one that diverged sharply from mainstream Judaism and perhaps fed into early Christianity. And that stream may have been censored from the beginning. There's also the case of 4Q285, often called the Pierced Messiah text. This tiny, damaged fragment includes a controversial phrase, interpreted by some to suggest a suffering, even slain, messianic figure. If true, it would radically alter our understanding of messianic expectations before the time of Jesus.
This is the only scroll to be found and preserved in its entirety. All other religious documents were uncovered in fragments. Since the book of Isaiah has a prominent messianic theme, scholars now know that this community, living just before Jesus' time.
For years, scholars debated the translation. Was it, "They shall kill the leader of the community," or "He shall kill the leader of the community"? The ambiguity fueled debate between Jewish and Christian scholars, each interpreting the text through their own theological lens. Now, with the help of AI-enhanced reconstruction, the text appears to lean closer to the suffering Messiah reading. This has led some to wonder, were these ideas of a Messiah who dies and rises already circulating before the rise of Christianity? And if so, were later scribes trying to hide or suppress them? These are not fringe questions anymore. They are central, and they force us to reconsider the origin of ideas we thought we're firmly rooted in one tradition or another. All of this raises a final, haunting possibility that we have built a machine that can see the past more clearly than we ever could, but only up to a point. AI can detect ink strokes. It can map handwriting to centuries. It can reconstruct missing lines. But it cannot yet comprehend human motive. It cannot tell us why someone omitted a line, chose one phrasing over another, or copied a fragment and buried it in a cave. That's our task, and it always will be. In this sense, the AI is not replacing scholars or theologians. It's provoking them, forcing them to confront questions that have long lingered at the edges of academic discourse. Questions of authenticity, intention, bias, power. Why did one community include the Book of Enoch in their canon, while others rejected it? Why do some scrolls refer to multiple messiahs, a priestly one and a royal one, while later texts focus only on one? What voices were lost, silenced, erased? These questions are not just historical, they're existential. They ask us what we are willing to remember and what we choose to forget. In the end, the story of the Dead Sea Scrolls is not just about words on parchment. It's about the very nature of truth, how it survives, who protects it, and what happens when we discover that even the oldest stories are still unfinished. AI has not answered these questions. It has amplified them. And so we return to the cave, not with torches and rope, but with algorithms and code. Searching, always searching. Not just for older texts, but for older truths. Not just for fragments, but for the full human voice behind them. The scrolls are not dead, and neither is the past. Now, with artificial intelligence joining the conversation, that mirror reflects in sharper detail. But it also fractures, showing us that there is no single fixed story. We end not with closure, but with curiosity. What else might we find? What else might we have done wrong? And what does it say about us that we built a machine smart enough to read the words of prophets, yet still rely on those words to understand who we are? That is the paradox. That is the wonder. The scrolls endure. The questions deepen. The future, like the past, remains open. Comment your thoughts in the section below. Thanks for staying until the end. Subscribe for more fascinating content.